All right. Oops. Sorry. So Sunday we looked at Matthew 14 and Mark 6. I brought my first page of my outline, by the way, today, but we're going to look at John 6 2 through 14. John adds a little bit more here um, to the context to what is going on when Jesus receives the news of his cousin being killed, being beheaded by Herod Antipas, and then his subsequent desire to be alone with him by himself, but also with his disciples. And he has great compassion on the 5,000. So this is John 6. I'm just going to start in verse 1 and through 14. It says, "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. When Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples, now the Passover feast of the Jews was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?' He said this to test him, for he himself knew, knew what he would do. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?' Jesus said, 'Have the people sit down.' Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, 'Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost.' So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, 'This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world.'" So it's interesting here that John's account is indeed slightly different, right? And I don't mean, that the major details are different, because they're not. Um, he does identify that there was a common of, even 200 denarii worth of bread is still not going to be enough for 5,000 plus people. And if you remember last time, we did discuss that because of Matthew's account, I believe, there is speculation, and maybe it's good speculation, and it's fine. I don't think it's, some people are super against. Well, I don't want to hear somebody's speculation. I want to hear this or that, but that there were more than just 5,000 people, because in Matthew 14:21, and those who ate were about 5,000 men besides women and children, right? So I briefly mentioned that I did a Greek word study on that word besides. What does that mean? And I found out that in some cases it does mean apart from, but it also can mean also absence, that there was potentially strictly 5,000 men. It doesn't matter, because whether it's 5,000 or 8,000, and Roper has a number as high as 15,000, to perform that miracle with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish would have been simply amazing. Barley loaf would have been roughly the size of your hand. Some images had it slightly bigger, but it would have been about an inch thick, very dense, about over 2.5 pounds. That's a pretty dense, piece of bread there. And the fish would have been relatively small too. My understanding is they would have been maybe the size of brook trout, which, on average don't get real big. I think Roper calls this a snack, or someone calls it a snack in one of the commentaries. It would have been a little bit more than that, but certainly not even enough to feed, 10 people. So, um, and again, so we see that 200 denarii. A denarii, remember, is basically a day's wage. To work for a day's wage, you'd be paid 1 denarii. So if you think about, how much would it cost to feed 5,000 people today, it would be quite a bit of money, depending on what we're serving, could be as much as half of our yearly wage potentially. So this miracle is amazing. I think because of the words of each gospel account, that the miracle wasn't, and we know that the miracle wasn't that these 5,000 plus people potentially were miraculously filled, right? That Jesus made them miraculously full physically because of the number of leftover fragment pieces, 12 baskets. All four Gospels had that, 12 baskets full of bread and fish. Um, I brought up how Jesus would have been extremely tired, hungry, because in Mark's account, for sure, I believe, and maybe even in Matthew's account, it says that they were so busy. I'm paraphrasing here, that's why I'm trying to get to it quick. They were so busy, they didn't even have time to eat. And so after, a day's journey, and they of course didn't eat like we do as Westerners today. In fact, if you know Middle Eastern cultures, um, lots of bread, lots of fish, um, you know, goat was fine and lamb was fine and things of that nature, but they didn't eat like we do today. Mark Mark 6, starting in verse 33. Yeah, right here. Verse 30, starting in verse 31, actually, Mark's account says, "And he said to them, 'Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat.'" So Jesus is tired, and so are his disciples, his apostles. And so they get in a boat and they travel across a section. Don't think, straight across the middle. They would have really kind of cut out just a little bit, and they would have gone from near Capernaum, which is northwest, to northeast of the Sea of Galilee, to a place near Bethsaida. In fact, it was Bethsaida. I had it down somewhere. Anyways, um, which by boat was probably maybe 3 miles, and if you were to travel that distance, it would have been closer to five-ish. I also did a study on how big some of these towns would have been back then, because reading Roper's figure, and again, this is good educated guesses by a scholarly man. I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's not quite, it's not a salvation issue, but Roper had as many as 15,000 people. So the city of Bethsaida in the late first century would have had that population, according to Roman census. Capernaum itself, I think, was 2,500, and or maybe I said 1,500, and then a town just north of the sea, about a mile off the coast of the sea, called Chorazin, would have had maybe 800 to 1,200. So the numbers were there for it to be as high as 15,000, and certainly 5,000 could have been there easily, because the towns were really close to within walking distance, and late first century numbers had 15,000 in Bethsaida alone. Um, because Jesus is tired and so is his disciples, it's not so much the miracle, it's what his own words, it's what the gospel writers write about him, saying he had compassion on them. That's in fact what Matthew uses, and Mark said, or no, maybe Matthew says that he like a sheep without a shepherd, which is interesting because we see that also in Matthew a couple weeks ago, that he uses that exact term. Uh, So Matthew's account in Matthew 14:14 says, "When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick." So though he's tired, though he's received really bad news, though he's very hungry, he still puts the needs of others before his own. Now we don't have time to get into how this specific account and what I read exactly is different than John's. But it doesn't mean that Matthew's account doesn't mean that the moment he stepped off the boat onto the sand or the dirt, he immediately saw the crowd. He was on shore, which still agrees with what John has to say. The only difference is John's account has him up on a mount of some kind. It doesn't necessarily have to be 1,000-foot peak or 4,000-foot peak. He was just up elevated, and he saw the crowd coming. The crowd coming as well. So Mark has the account of they were like sheep without a shepherd. And I think that's, again, important because it's echoed other times in the Gospels. All right, let's look. y- Right, right. Which we talked about. I talked about. So I forgot you were up at Murphy's. If you think about 5,000 people in general, that's a huge crowd. I mean, that's huge. I've been at big community dinners, but there were a few hundred, right? And so maybe 500 was the biggest dinner I've ever been to. And so you're talking, you know, yeah, let me do the math right, 10 times that, right? And so, but to put them in hundreds and fifties, oh man, I mean that's even if you put them in hundreds, that's 50 of them. And so logistically, this would have taken a long time, right? So I think that's part of the miracle. I imagine when he's sitting them down in the groups and he's organizing them, there's information about, hey, here's some stuff, break it and pass it, and break it and pass it, and that's again speculation, but right, he had them grouped in small amounts. What's interesting is in John's account, when I read that for the first time, he specifically says, and those who were sitting were fed, or he fed them. And so my thought was, well, what if they weren't sitting? Did they not get fed? But I think that's just, again, reading it literally, and who's to say? It doesn't necessarily matter all that much. But yeah, John says, uh, yeah, John 6:11, it says, Jesus then took the loaves, and we had given thanks. He distributed them to those who were seated, which again, I enjoy those subtle differences and kind of looking at some things. So I think what we can glean here and what we need to take away as Christians today is that the example of Jesus having great compassion on those who were in need, both spiritually and physically, um, he put their needs before his own desires and his own physical needs. And what an example when it comes to trying to reach out and help people in the community, putting the needs of others before ours. So in Roper's outline, he's got a few scriptures. I'm going to read them. If you want to write them down, fine. The context, I mean, this one in Galatians 6:10, the context here is speaking about the church, but in Galatians 6:10, it says, "So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are in the household of faith." I know I've said a number of times that we often overlook and speed past that three-letter word, all. And so when we read and understand this, Paul is saying, do good to everyone you ever come across. Now, doing good doesn't necessarily meaning give them money every time they ask. It doesn't mean to feed them every time they ever show up to your door. It means to just do good. Now, part of being good would be to take care of their physical needs if they need them, but part of being good would also be to take care of their spiritual needs as people come and get help. But I just feel, the amount of time I've spent in some of our brotherhood, the churches in our brotherhood, we don't sit down and really contemplate that three-letter word. It's to all. It's to everybody, right? And I brought up how we need to kind of be careful with our attitudes, right? For example, my brother-in-law. So I said this Sunday, but it's not mine. It's not my quote. It's my brother-in-law. Many of you know Nick, know enough about Nick, but he goes, man, sometimes we're so worried that someone's going to get a free lunch on us, right? They're going to take advantage of our good deeds or our honest and sincere hearts. But he says, look, that doesn't matter. That's on them. And so the idea was, he says, no one gets a free lunch on God, meaning God ultimately knows, right? My dad's younger brother, he passed away. I was probably like 9 years old, but his name was Gary. And so my uncle Gary would always give not just food if he had food, or not just go into McDonald's and buy a homeless guy a meal. He'd even give him a little bit of change. And as we got a little older, and my dad and my grandfather especially, his Gary's dad and my dad's dad would, why you always do that, Gary? And what if these people just take advantage of you? Where if they go into that store and buy liquor with the $5 you gave them? And his response was always, I'd rather give it to 1,000 people, right? And you've heard this stuff before, right? I'd rather give it to 1,000 people and 999 of them use them for something wrong, than to not give it out and not fulfill that one person who really needed that, right? And so I think when it comes down to trying to be smart, you try to be smart, but it's okay if you decide to give a couple bucks to somebody. I told you the story last Sunday that I was at the local gas station right around the corner from my house because it's the cheapest in Manteca and it's close. And a guy asked me for some change. He asked if I had any change on him, and I didn't have any change on me physically, but in my cup holders I did. I said no, I didn't. And part of the reason was I was this close to saying, "Let me see what I got," when he was hiding in his jacket pocket, inside the jacket, he was hiding a bottle of brown liquor, and I'm like, I don't want to, I'm not going to feed into that. But I have been at the same gas station, and there was a guy sitting outside and asking me for change, and I'm like, I'll buy you a bunch of snacks, man. I have done that, and I'm not trying to, please, I'm not trying to gloat. What I'm saying is, we need to do good to everyone, right? And so there's a lot of programs the local congregation can pick up to help out too. And unfortunately, in the brotherhood, there are some mixed emotions and differences of opinions what it means to, how do we reach out and help those in need, specifically widows and orphans. And that's there in James chapter 1, right? That's where we're going next, is James chapter 1 and verse 27. Whose responsibility is it to take care of? When we get in discussions like that in leadership meetings, or if it's just a men's meeting or whatever, I'm always an advocate of saying, let's stop some of this. Whether it comes from individuals or comes from the congregation, we as individuals make up the church, the body, right? And does that mean that the church has to have a completely separate account to specific? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. But if it's the hub where we can make collection to take up a common, you know, need, then I think that's what we need to do. And Paul says so much as well, right? Each congregation would lay aside for the needy ones, specifically in Jerusalem, which is interesting. You see that in Romans 15, I believe. Of course, we see that in 1 Corinthians 16. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 16. So anyways, we as individuals and as the body need to have compassion on people. Again, James 1:27 says, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our Lord, of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress. Here's why it's kind of interesting how this outline connects with stuff we were talking about just a few weeks ago, because widows and orphans would have been viewed by a Judeo-Christian, a immature Judeo-Christian, as not being as worthy as the robe-wearing, right, synagogue, visiting Jewish individual. They would have been considered the outcast, the shunned, even in their own religion, even in their own Jewish culture. And oh, by the way, who does James likely write this to? Primarily, the first readers would have been Judeo-Christian. And depending on which scholar you want to go with, James is likely either the first or within the first three books ever written and passed around. The letter of James to the church in Jerusalem, by the way. So interesting to see some of this stuff. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17. Now, see where we're going here? So we're kind of talking about everybody, right? Then we're talking, maybe we say orphans and widows, but maybe the concept to the original reader was Jewish or Judeo-Christian women and orphans. And now we see here specifically to the church. And by the way, that's the last part of Galatians 6:10, right? So do good to all, period. And especially to those who are in the household of God, right? So there's extra emphasis. If we have a needy brother or sister, we need to try to help them. We need to try to help them. But in 1 John 3:17, it says, but whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him, right? So again, we're talking about specifically someone who is in need. Rober has this in his outline. He said, there are some that should not be helped. I don't like that wordage. I think we kind of understand what he means. because we know what Scripture says, right? 2 Thessalonians 3:10. For even if we were with you, we used to give you this order: if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either, right? So there is the idea of, look, we need to be out as best as we physically can, given our specific, I won't say lifestyle, because that's not what I'm talking about, but given our home life, family life, whatever that may be, um, to be out there working for the nourishment or goods that we receive. Um, and again, that's in 2 Thessalonians 3:10. I just don't like the idea of should not be held. Nevertheless, let's keep going. People with needs in Jesus' time. Again, we read Mark 32 through 34. People ran to meet them, right? So Jesus anticipated them. He saw them. He didn't run away. He didn't say, "Oh, this is somebody else's business." His disciples did. His apostles did. Read again Mark and Matthew's account, where basically his disciples said, "Send them away. It's getting late. We are in a desolate place." By the way we read that is the disciples were a little bit scared of the dark. That's kind of how we get that, right? I brought that up last time. That's kind of what they meant. They're, looking over their shoulders. And I brought up how, as a grown man, and I didn't tell a story of my dad, but my dad knows exactly what I'm talking about. As a grown man, I'll be in the woods sometimes, and I get a little bit late back to the Jeep, and all of a sudden that tree that I know is a tree is a monster coming after me. I'm a grown man, and I start looking around, and and my dad knows what I'm talking about, being in Colorado too and getting turned around. And finally, you see the glow of the campfire and you sit down because you're not going to run back into camp out of breath and sweating like you've been afraid of the dark. So you catch your breath, for 5, 7 minutes and then you walk in. But, anyways, that's kind of the idea. They were afraid here. Where they were in this side of Galilee as well was also where potentially Jesus heals the demon possessed men who acknowledge him and acknowledge his power, and they ask to be sent into that herd of pigs. And I believe that's all basically where this happens in the general area. I mean, within a few miles. So there was kind of some things like that. Jesus received them compassionately. There was an open welcome. They had physical needs. He healed their sick and fed the people. They had spiritual needs. He taught them, right? Especially Mark and Matthew's account discusses that. I think Mark uses the term taught them the kingdom of heaven, or taught them about the kingdom of heaven. And Matthew says that he simply taught them. I mean, it wouldn't have been simple, but you know what I mean. Um, so people have needs today, of course, right? I mean, we get them all the time. They have spiritual needs, right? Spiritual needs. I mean, we live in a pretty affluent state with a pretty affluent community, and we run into people all the time who are building up and storing up treasures on earth, right? We work with some of them, right? Um, and here he has Matthew 6:26, which is the quote or the scripture that says, "What will it profit a man?" Right? In fact, a couple months ago, I think I preached basically on that. That's the cost of discipleship. Deals with the cost of discipleship. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet loses his soul or forfeits his soul? And again, we live next to people that are like that. We work with people that are like that. We see them all the time. And it's sad. It's frustrating. Um, so, people have spiritual needs. They have need for basic necessities, food and clothing, right? Um, Widows and orphans. Again, that's James 1:27. James 2:15, by the way, is food and clothing. The sick. What's interesting is he quotes from Matthew 25:36 here, but when I often think about the sick, I think about James' account. James chapter 5, towards the very end, it's like verse 14, where it says, if anyone is, well, it starts off by saying, if anyone, I believe, is happy or joyous, they should praise or give alms to God. Here, I got it right now. Oh, here we go. It starts in 5:13. I was a little bit backward. It says, is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing praise. If anyone among you is sick, let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And And the prayer of faith will save the one who is sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Right. So a lot of this is discussing the supernatural, miraculous. Okay, that's what is going on here. Right. But I also know that there's members sitting in this amongst us right now that when people are sick, we don't typically hear about it, but they're out there trying to see and fulfill their needs. They didn't necessarily call an elder, they took it upon themselves. The reason why James says call an elder here is likely an elder during this time would have had the gift, the miraculous gift of the Holy Spirit, and they could indeed lay hands on and heal people like that. But again, you know, I still ask the people that I feel are very righteous to pray over me. I do. Well, you say pray for me? Um, Whether it is for a sin or sins, or if I'm struggling with this or that, emotional things or, stress or whatever that may be. So, um, again, interesting here. Um, when we're sick, people need certain things. Bereaved, if they're sad, right? And that was something our leadership has been discussing about how to get um, uh, people in our membership together who are or who have been recently bereaved or struggling, because it is something important. It's something we need to do as Christians, is to be there for one another and fulfill needs. And it needs to be more than a card, and it needs to be more than. No, I'm not saying the cards are bad; they're wonderful. Don't get me wrong. I mean, incredibly wonderful things. More than cards and text messages and phone calls. It means a lot when someone shows up, in your home, um, when you've been sick, or if you're in a home or a hospital and things of that nature, visiting the Meisners. And I said, there's people in our setting right now, and they know who they are, and I know that they know that I know who they are. But they do amazing work, and it's seriously an encouragement, a great example. Let's see. Uh, Again, he talks about programs, and and we. By the way, I've dropped the ball on some stuff with some of our excuses, which we're going to get to in just a moment. Um, but but I've dropped the ball in some of these things. I think it is okay, and we should have a central location where we could have some clothing items. Like I said, it may be a little different here in Ripon, right? Pretty affluent community. Davis Park, where my brother-in-law is at, they've got a huge clothing closet, and they have a huge um, um, satellite food bank that and they use it weekly. I mean, people are down there all the time. So, anyways, we'll get into that in a second. Um, but it's interesting here is we need to not forget our priorities, and what are they? Right, love God and love others. Right, there's some application for us today. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in needs, I said this before, and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Right. What's interesting here, um, well, okay. If someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. And this commandment, excuse me, we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. That's 1 John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. So how some avoid, and again, I think it's, for me, I'm guilty of some of this stuff. I am. Okay. When Jesus was asked to feed the crowds, the apostles responded like we do at times. They made excuses. I brought that up briefly. We talked about it Sunday. Their attitude was, let them go into the towns and the villages and buy food and find somewhere to stay for the night. Let them do it. We got to get out of here, Jesus. I mean, that's kind of what's going on here. Like, it's getting late, right? We're hungry. We wanted to be alone. These people are interfering with what we wanted to do this evening, this afternoon, right? Um, Here he says, what are some of our responses? We could list them on a board, right? What were the apostles' responses? Their excuses, I mean. We don't have the resources, right? How are we going to feed 5,000 people, or 5,000 plus, maybe 8,000 people, maybe 10? We have nothing. Oh, this boy, this young lad over here has a snack, as it's kind of described sometimes, with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. We can't hardly feed 5 people with that. And so they made some excuses. In John's account, we read Christ challenges Philip's faith, right? Um, his response and others were, even 200 denarii wasn't going to be enough. Jesus asked for what was available. They knew how much food they had, 5 loaves and 2 fish. By the way, the loaf discussed here is not what we think of a bread loaf. Okay, so I should have read that more carefully. We are focused at times. Here's number 2. So that was number 1. We don't have the resources. We don't have the resources. There's an excuse, right? And Roper doesn't specify what we mean. Okay? Number 2 is we are so focused on our budget that we think money is the answer to every problem. Some of this stuff I was like, man, hitting close to home here, Roper, right? Whether it's from an individual level or whether it's from a congregational level. And I know we have responsibilities as a congregation to do certain things that we've already said we were going to do when it comes to responsibilities and things of that nature. But man, the way I read it, we are so focused on our budget that we think money is the answer to every problem. So at times, we in the leadership and the eldership here and in general, I think we need to kind of check ourselves on that, right? Now, we live in a Western culture that demands, we pay for electricity and things of that nature, right? We don't have candles in here and things of that nature. But are we overemphasizing some of this, right? Is that where do we lead based upon the dollar amount? And so, again, we got to check ourselves sometimes. How many resources? I thought this was beautiful. How many resources does God have? Right? Infinite. Infinite resources. Are his resources limited? The answer is no. We must rely on God and his resources. Sometimes we say it's not our problem. Right? It's not our problem. That's basically what the apostles said. So that, according to Roper, send the crowd away. We do not think it is our responsibility. Right? You don't think it's our responsibility. Well, again, this is a trickle-down effect, and this is kind of what I was saying before. From a congregational leadership standpoint, we need to figure out what is our responsibility then. What is if we're part of a congregation? I'm not saying Ripon is like this. I'm not, but if we're part of a congregation that says, well, we want to encourage our individual members to take up and provide for the needs from an individual level because we interpret or we feel or we whatever it may be, then still we need to know what our responsibility is. Personally, I don't like to divide it like that, but right, I serve under eldership as well. So we do not like to be disturbed. I thought that was kind of interesting, right? We don't like to be disturbed. I tell you what, I did an internship a few summers ago. In fact, it was during COVID, just so everyone knows. I could have done it here, but an internship is where you learn and you get exposure to things. And Davis Park is an active congregation, specifically in homeless outreach. That's why I chose to go there. I'd done a little bit before in Fresno, but not as in an organized manner. And I tell you what, to be around homeless people and to deal with not only their behavior, but some of their addictions. Um, uh, let's be honest, some of the smell. Davis Park opened up their church building and has a shower like we have. In fact, they have 4 showers, but they let them use 2 of them, and they give them called showers of love. Now, again, Modesto has a larger population of homeless people than we do, right? Um, but but we have to be of the attitude that we're willing to give up certain things, certain attitudes about, well, I'm busy this day, or I got this going on. And I'm not saying that you notice I didn't say we have to give it all up, right? Um, Jesus did, so does his disciples. But can we still serve the kingdom and yet encourage our kids and give our kids opportunities to do sports or whatever it may be? The answer is yes, right? Um, but to have an attitude like it's bothersome, or we don't want to be bothered by it. It's a big deal. We don't have the time. I'm guilty of this all the time. I don't have the time. I got a girl in comp gymnastics. My son baseball starting before I was here. I was in a 2 hour and 10 board meeting for Manteca Little League. It was supposed to be 1 hour, by the way. That was the agenda time, right? I'm too busy. I got sports. I got this. I got that, right? We all fall guilty of this stuff. We even justify by saying they got themselves into this, right? Well, we can't really help the homeless because really what they need is mental health help and addiction help. That's what they need. Look, I've been out there. I literally have been out there in the streets of Fresno. And somebody said, in fact, I'll give you one quick example. I know I'm out of time. Someone said something very inappropriate a male did to Serena while we were dating. It was very perverse and crude, and he was not of his right mind. And I wanted to go back and knock the rest of his teeth out. And I didn't. But what I'm saying is, if we go, oh, they just need help with this and this and that, and we can't do much because they need addiction help and they need mental health. I'm actually in agreement with that. But look, if they come in and say they're hungry, and we got the means, then let's feed them. Let's feed them. But what if we don't get anything out of it? Ooh, we got to watch that attitude. We got to watch that attitude. They don't deserve it, right? And that kind of ties in with they got themselves into this. How can we help? I mean, I'm a little bit over, but most of our elders aren't here. Dave won't say anything, but no, uh, I think we can see where we can help, right? We can help both at an individual level, and we can help out at a congregational level. My dad and I have dropped the ball on some of this stuff. We've made excuses. We were going to come up. My dad and I went down on one of those homeless outreach days on Thursday down to Davis Park, and we sat down with their bookkeeper. We sat down with both ministers. We sat down with people in charge of the pantry out there, and we got all of this information. We got a lot of the questions answered that some of the leadership had about this. And my dad and I both said, we'll come up with a report and do a nice presentation for you. And that should have been done in August. So it's on me. I get it. But can we do better moving on? Do I recognize those things, and do we potentially need to get stuff in place? Of course. It's about our attitude. At the end of the day, it's about our attitude. I think that's the most applicable thing. Look at Jesus. I mean, if we found out, I mean, many of us have loved ones, have family members, right? If we found out that a close family member had passed away, many of us are going to want to go see him, or see the family. We're not going to see them, but see the family of those who lost the loved one, the immediate family, right? Get together and plan a memorial, and who's going to bring this and who's going to bring that. And yet, Jesus was in the same boat, really. And he was hungry and he was tired, and he put the needs of others before him. And I think that's the ultimate example, and that's what we can glean from that. So I actually didn't do the review questions, and that's again on me a little bit. My procedure yesterday, and I was just kind of laid up. And so, anywho, thank you for your attention. I'm over. Who's got the invitation tonight?